Neerav, thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you. And as you know, we're launching discussions with a number of education leaders who have played a pivotal role in helping education systems transition from moments of crisis to recovery and prosperity thereafter. And I think your story and the story of New Orleans is particularly interesting. There are a number of people who have studied what happened in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina from August 2005 onwards. But we have today with you somebody who's experienced it up close and personal and has played a significant role in the recovery of the city and of Louisiana as a whole. So Neerav, please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and tell us your journey. How did you come to New Orleans, and what was it like to be part of the recovery process in the city?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to have the conversation. So I grew up in a small town in Indiana, right outside of Chicago. And from there, I went to college at Tulane University, which is in New Orleans. So that was my first introduction to the city, was as a student. And while I was there, I volunteered at a public school, and I'd gone to public schools in the hometown where I grew up, and they were great. My conscience was just shocked. I walked into a room where the teacher had her feet on the desk and was reading the newspaper. Kids were just running around. There was no learning going on, and it was my job to tutor a kid to teach him how to read, who was illiterate at second grade. And it was just horrific. The kids were not getting the love, the attention, the academic rigor that they deserved. The building was falling apart. And I did that tutoring process. Unfortunately, I think I was of no use to the children there, but it definitely motivated me to try to make public education better in America. And to drive the point home of just how tough things were at that very school I tutored at, there was a school shooting at the middle school where I believe it was a seventh grader slid a gun under the fence to another student, who then shot another student, and that student shot him back. So the combination of lack of academics, lack of nurturing of students, and extreme violence was just really, really horrific. Now, fast forward to the end, there is now a KIPP charter school in that very same building. It's one of the higher performing schools in New Orleans. So in that sense, the story has a really great ending for kids. And the journey, in some sense, is what happened between those early years in 2000s and where we're at now.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let's unpack that story. So, in and around 2005, at least 2006, you took on a role with New Schools for New Orleans, and then stayed with the organization, became CEO. And then I think you left around about 2012, if I'm correct. So clearly, with that organization and with the work you did, you had a front row seat in the efforts that were being taken to bring New Orleans' education system back to where it needed to be. Do you mind taking us through that journey from when you arrived up until the time that you transitioned?
Sure. New Schools for New Orleans was founded by an amazing entrepreneur, a woman named Sarah Houston, and so all credit goes to her for founding the organization. I was actually in law school at the time. I'd moved away from New Orleans, and I just started volunteering, trying to fly back to New Orleans to see what I could do to help. I met her, and she took a chance on me, and I was part of the founding team there. I'd really divide up the time in New Orleans in two phases. The first 4 to 5 years were just getting schools back up off the ground in a situation where the city had been devastated by a natural disaster and children had suffered an immense amount of post-traumatic stress. And we needed new schools to get them going. The method we used was charter schools. The big difference there was, instead of the public school system being run by the government, they delegated that authority to nonprofit organizations. And our rough theory here was that nonprofit organizations could be somewhat insulated from the political turnover that's bound to happen and should happen in democracy. So we wanted the school board, the elected oversight, to be more of a regulatory agency that would then make sure the nonprofit schools were educating kids and playing by the rules and serving all kids equitably. So the first 4 to 5 years was a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of launching schools. It was incredibly difficult. Creating schools, as many of the people will be watching this video, is just one of the hardest things to do in the world. And we got to work with some amazing people who set up some nonprofit organizations that started to scale and do well. And midway through that process, as we lifted our heads up, we saw the nonprofit schools doing better than the traditional government-run schools. And that just got us thinking, well, what if the whole system started transitioning to be nonprofit? What would a public school system look like then? And that really led into phase two, which was much more policy oriented. If you're going to have a system where the government's a regulator and nonprofits are running the schools, how do you make sure that system's equitable? How do you make sure it serves all kids? And what we ended up doing through trial and error is we really centralized a lot of equity functions. So school operations were very decentralized. The nonprofit educators in the building got to call the shots and make the decisions on teachers, curriculum, and so forth. But when it came to enrollment or expulsion or serving special needs students, that all got centralized pretty tightly with the government because we wanted to make sure no kids were falling through the cracks. So that, I think, ended up being the magic of New Orleans, giving a lot of power to great entrepreneurial educators, but also centralizing some real authority in government to make sure every kid was getting served.
That's fascinating. So the decentralization gave individual schools and school communities the power to make decisions that translated to the betterment of education for individual children. But at the same time, they operated as part of a broader network, if you like, that was coordinating and facilitating. I spent some time at Ashoka, and Bill Drayton over at Ashoka began a few years ago to talk about the idea of teams as a mechanism for creating change. And I recently read a McKinsey article that brought in the same idea. They talked about network of teams. Are those concepts, are those ideas relevant to the New Orleans experience at all?
Definitely, and I love that. I think, one thing that's underemphasized in the nonprofit sector is it's really a soft form of competition, right? Like on some level, you want your nonprofit to be the best, and like any entrepreneur, you have a sense of pride in doing something well and amazing. But on the other hand, you want everybody else to succeed. It's not zero sum. Every school can be good and serve kids. And I think that was one of the most powerful aspects of New Orleans. Part of it was because we were coming out of a tragedy, and so there was some natural bonding through that. But I really do felt like no matter which organization you were in the city, we all felt like we were part of something special. And that became really important, particularly in the latter phase when you were designing these regulations, because you needed the buy-in of all the schools to make it happen. And you needed them to trust that we were all heading in the same direction. So when you take the nonprofits who are running the schools, the support organizations like New Schools for New Orleans, the talent organizations, the government itself, I do think team of teams is an apt way to describe the ecosystem that was built in the city.
Great. So as you know, there are a number of articles and analyses being developed looking back at the New Orleans experience and trying to pull forward lessons and ideas that would translate into this unprecedented coronavirus pandemic context in which we're in. Given your specific vantage point, how would you describe the lessons that might be drawn from New Orleans that translate into the United States and potentially into other parts of the world in terms of constructing an ecosystem that will support rapid recovery? And some people talk about building back better. What kind of lessons support us doing this well?
Yep. So let me run through kind of three pieces there. One is the results we got in New Orleans. Two, are there any other broader lessons that we could draw for other cities? And then three, what are the implications in the time of pandemic now? So the results for New Orleans were very, very strong. We had independent researchers out of Tulane University Economics Department do a longitudinal study, and they said the test score results they saw were the largest they'd seen of any city they'd ever studied before. We roughly took New Orleans from the lowest performing one or two school districts in the state to near the state average. Over time, high school graduation rates went from about 50% to nearing 80%. And if you get into statistical terms, we had a 0.4 standard deviation jump in test scores. To put that in context, the black-white opportunity achievement gap in the United States is about 0.8 standard deviations. So in just 6 years, we made a pretty big dent in some of the gaps we're trying to close around the country. What we have not yet seen is it's an open question whether those reforms in elementary, middle, and high school will lead to post-secondary success and then jobs. I mean, the goal here is kids lead meaningful lives with great employment and can contribute to their community. So I just think it's worth noting that we don't know that yet, but we did see very strong gains in the K-12 sector. In terms of implications for other cities, so right now I lead an organization called the City Fund, and our mission is to try to figure exactly this question out. There were a couple other cities in America that also saw a lot of gains in this time, Denver, Washington, D.C. And so we've tried to take some of those lessons, and we're in the process of getting to about 10 to 15 cities where we want to try similar strategies and see if we get the same results. So we'll hire researchers again to hold the mirror up and see if it worked. I think in philanthropy, you have to kind of grow with your results. And so we think New Orleans was an amazing success story that is still improving. And we want to learn whether this will work at a next level of scale. And so, I consider us in phase 2 in that sense. Some of the key strategies we're using are nonprofit governance. We believe that's incredibly important to give educators the stability to run great schools over time. And then we also are really trying to work with cities on these equity functions. So things like fair enrollment, expulsion, and funding systems are all really important to us. And we'll find out. We're probably a decade away from knowing whether these lessons we saw in New Orleans can work in other cities in America and maybe across the world. And then the last question on the pandemic itself, I think that's very idiosyncratic city by city, and I think in country by country. One of the things that was very important about the reforms in New Orleans is people really didn't want to go back to the way it was before. There was an understanding that the public school systems were not serving kids the way they needed to be. And I think that's a pretty important gating question as you think through in your own home. Are people hungry to go back to the way things were? And in a pandemic, that might be the case. Like they just want their kids back in schools. Or is this moment of disruption a chance to rethink, how things could be better? And, that probably just depends on people's perceptions of what the system was like before the crisis.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you. You may be familiar with Fernando Remes from Harvard University. He recently wrote a book, edited a book that was titled Letter to a New Minister of Education. And in it, there were a number of education thought leaders who were presenting their frame and their ideas for what a minister entering a new mandate should be thinking about as they're looking to deliver on the expectation of children and families. And so if you were writing the last chapter in that book, what would you say?
All order. Every country is so different that I'm hesitant to give advice to a generic minister. But I will answer your question. I won't duck it. I think the core themes of giving educators more power to make decisions closest to kids and to figure out a way where that power can be durable. My hunch is that will be extremely important in a variety of settings. in New Orleans, in the United States of America, for us, it was nonprofits, were a way to keep the focus public. You know, they're not for-profit entities, but to create some governance stability. So if you were to do something well, it could last for years and years. You know, the great universities across the world have been around for decades, churches even longer than that. Uh, you know, for us, the question we were asking is, you know, couldn't that be the same for elementary, middle, high schools in America, that in 100 years we'd look back and there are these long-standing institutions that have just done amazing things and that, you know, weren't thrown out every time a new superintendent or minister comes in. So maybe my overarching advice to the minister would be, you're going to be gone in a couple of years. Is there any chance that, you know, what you've done to educators can endure? And for us, who and how schools are governed is a key question that should be answered if you want to think about reform sustaining beyond one individual politician.
It's helpful. So let's turn to the question of learning loss. That's an idea, a theme that's on many lips and on many pieces of paper today, as people are worried about what being out of school does for children who are used to a continuation of learning. And so you've got, again, many countries across the world trying to figure out whether they should open in a moment of uncertainty about the health implications of reopening, and others that are taking the view that they need to just stop everything and give time for them to plan very carefully and figure it out. But in the meantime, everyone is dealing with the concern that whatever children might have learned up to that point, they might lose. And then the recovery process to get back to, at least back to where they were, might take a really long time. You know, you're more familiar with the statistics in New Orleans about how long it took for children to get back to where they were. But could you speak to those perhaps who are listening and watching who might be wrestling with this question of what to do about learning loss?
It's really, really worrisome. You know, I think there's a major risk that kids living in poverty without the resources of the wealthy are just going to fall further and behind in this time, particularly if schools themselves are physically closed. So I think you're right to worry about it, and we're very worried too. I don't know that I'm particularly optimistic on this one. You know, if you wanted to draw some source of optimism from the New Orleans story, you know, if you look at the gains we got, which again, you know, the researchers said were the largest they'd seen in any city in the country's recent history, we got those gains with kids going through incredible trauma, you know, had to flee their city, live in shelters, most on and off missed a year of schooling in some way or another, then came back to their city, and then got incredible academic gains. So to the extent that the next year is going to be what it is on some level, and you will see losses, New Orleans did show that in one very specific circumstance, you can fast forward 6 years later and those kids were farther ahead than they've ever been. But, you know, I don't know whether that's possible at scale or not. So I think it is a very, very hard issue that the world's going to be grappling with over the next year.
And perhaps I might drill down with you just a little bit to ask the question that I think would be on everybody's minds. What's the secret sauce? How did you in New Orleans get so many different players and stakeholders with multiple perspectives on what to do to work so effectively together in a way that translated not just to immediate sort of recovery for children, but a long-term and well-documented and evidenced progress and sort of uplift of education opportunities for kids? How do you get everyone to sing from the same hymn sheet?
I don't know if I ever did. So I want to be open about that. And there, to be honest, there's some things I would definitely do differently if we had to do it all over again. You know, in a post-emergency situation, we definitely moved fast. And at times we were probably not as inclusive as we should have been. And I think that ended up hampering the reform efforts in later years because it wasn't diverse enough and didn't have enough community support. Now I think we've rebounded from that and feel very comfortable about where New Orleans is at now, but that took a while. I think there were two key things that made the first 5 years of New Orleans deliver so much success. One is we had top to down political support. So the president put a big federal stimulus package into New Orleans after Katrina. He was a Republican. The governor at the time was a Democrat. She supported all the reforms. The state superintendent was a Republican, then a Democrat. They both supported the reforms. And then the mayor for most of the time was Mitch Landrieu, a Democrat who supported the reforms. So we had bipartisan city, state, and federal support, and that lasted a good 5 or 6 years. And I don't think we could have accomplished what we would have accomplished without that political cover. So that was one, and extremely, extremely important. And then two was the educator base we built. Our organization or the district was not the group that was figuring out what every kid needs. And if a school needed to stay open till 5 p.m. because the kid had just lost a year worth of learning, they could make that call. And educators were pitching in to work longer hours, to do whatever it took for kids. So I think the nonprofit governance and the freedom that provided in terms of curricular hiring, labor, hours, allowed educators to do whatever it took to get kids caught up. And that's a pretty magical combination. If you can get political cover to free up educators to work hard for kids, amazing things can happen.
In moments of crisis, we often, our minds lean towards solutions that are driven by systems and policies and approaches and strategies, but oftentimes we forget about the people. And I wonder in this 8-year journey that you had in New Orleans, at least 8 years, how did the crisis and the recovery process and the progression towards success shape you as a leader?
It's a good question. So many ways. I'm so different than the person I was. Then a couple of lessons I think that shaped me. It increased my pragmatism. Like when you're in school, you can write papers on this or that. But when you're on the ground launching school after school, and you are judged by whether those schools educate kids, theory in many sense gets thrown out the window. And you become much more obsessed with trying to figure out what's going to work for any given classroom at any given school at any given moment. And I think that was clarifying for me, and is something I've tried to take since. I think our organization now is very pragmatically oriented, very evidence-based, and then also just very sensitive to what's politically feasible and possible in any given moment. So I would say increasingly pragmatist by having forced through trial and error to find what works in any given city. Definitely number one. Number two is I think it's made me much more politically minded. Particularly as I moved from New Orleans to other cities, and I saw what it was like to do work when you didn't have that political cover. I took for granted a lot of the political cover we did have. And so I think that process has led me to think much more deeply about the politics of any city or state when you're trying to undertake major reforms in education. And that's been a pretty big takeaway. And then I would say, and this kind of goes with the pragmatism, just a humility, kind of a combination of humility and confidence that I think I've learned to grow very, very quickly and absorb new ideas very, very quickly, because that's what the situation had demanded. And then have built up, because I'm 15 years in, the things I do hold beliefs in, I'm fairly confident about them, because they've been tested on the ground and iterated on for over a decade. So that cycles of deep, constant learning leading into core strategies, I think, took over a decade to build.
Great. We talked about the advice or recommendations we might very humbly give to ministers of education. What might you say to people on the funding side, people who are driving decisions within philanthropy, for example? What role did they play? Perhaps you could use the example of New Orleans, but and project into the current pandemic. Why is philanthropy important, and what role should it be playing currently?
The type of philanthropy that I love and that we aspire to when we're doing our own grant making is the kind that is willing to make major bets on low probability outcomes, but that if they work can change everything. So philanthropy is uniquely positioned to do things government can't, and government shouldn't, for the most part, be making radical bets. Government should be more in the business of funding things that have proven to work. And so in that sense, philanthropy is kind of a risk capital. And so I think that puts the onus on philanthropy to have a pretty high risk tolerance to do things that, again, if they work, have a plausible path to scale. So, the work we were doing in New Orleans, some philanthropists said, well, they are doing bold, ambitious things that are restructuring the way we think about public education. And if that works in one city, maybe over decades, it could work for every city in America. So we were doing something that was big enough that if it worked, could be game changing. And we've also been humble about it in the sense where it worked in one city, and now those same philanthropists plus some others are helping us go to 10 to 15. So they were willing to make a big bet. They're willing to grow with us. And I'm confident that, if we keep on getting good results and kids keep on learning more, they'll stick with us for decades. So that kind of bold, patient capital that takes big risks for high upside is pretty amazing and a very unique role that really only philanthropy can do.
Great. You've been very patient with me. I have just 3 more questions for you, and they should be quick ones. The first is, I suppose the stakeholder group that we haven't talked about are parents. And oftentimes in education systems, parents can get sidelined in terms of their views, their perspectives, and their contributions to the process of creating meaningful education opportunities for kids. Could you speak to what you've learned and what you might want to see for parents today?
Yeah. We work with parents in 2 ways that I think are both extremely important and complementary. One is giving them a greater voice at the table. So in every city we're in, we try to fund an organization that is actually led by parents. So the CEO is a mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, some family member whose kids have been or currently are in the system, and that the staff and the organized constituency is all parents. And we're pretty loose with the agenda they run, and it's really to give them voice and empower them to be at the policymaking table. So I think that's one thing that's really important. I think the other really, really important is to give families choice. Policy making is slow, takes time, and families have kids that are in schools right now. And if they're in a failing school, they don't have time to wait 10 years for the new system to be built. They just need a better school for their kid. And so growing these nonprofit schools that give families a chance to exit a system that's not working is pretty important too. So I think voice and exit are the 2 things we hope to really give families in the cities we work in so that they can exercise power in both those ways.
Thank you. Now related to, well, I'll ask you a personal question and then ask the last one. Personal question is, what was your favorite book when you were a child, and what's your favorite book today?
Favorite book when I was a child? Trying to think. Well, I'll jump to high school so we can have a little more literature. 2 books that really struck me and books I still think about to this day were East of Eden and Crime and Punishment. East of Eden, one of the core questions there is, do we have free will or not? And what does that mean in terms of morality and ethics? And, Crime and Punishment is a similar book framed around an ethical question of morality and who it applies to and why. So literature that gets to those deep, what does it mean to be human and be in a just society? Those were pretty impactful for me growing up. My reading tastes have shifted so much. I read a little less fiction now. I would say books that have really impacted me today are, I think the genre title is like Big History and Big Future. So Guns, Germs of Steel by Jared Diamond, Sapiens by Harari, books that kind of situate the human experience over hundreds of thousands of years are very meaningful to me, both to give a sense of perspective and to help explain the why of why we're here, why different countries are in different places, why different societies are structured the way they are. And then I really love forward-looking books. Toby Ord has a new book about existential risk. It's called The Precipice, and trying to understand what the greatest threats forward-looking are to humanity. So I like stretching my mind thousands of years into the future and behind us in my reading today.
Excellent, thank you. So my last question for you, as we're confronting COVID-19 and the implications for education systems, what do you think we're not doing, or what gaps are there in our thinking globally and locally, I suppose? And what advice would you give everyone who's paying attention to this challenge? What rocks do we need to look under that we're not paying attention to?
Yep. So I'll start with, I think the greatest lesson of the pandemic and COVID has nothing to do with education. It's that humanity is heavily underinvested in global threats, whether that's biological or synthetic viruses, whether it's nuclear war, whether it's climate change. There's a top 10 of things that we've known about for 20 to 30 years that we could have been working on. And through lack of public understanding and government inaction, we are woefully underinvesting and underprepared. So my one hope from the pandemic is that we got lucky. It's not the worst version of what a pandemic could be. And I really, really hope we'll be so much better prepared for when the bad one hits. Not to underestimate how bad this one's been, but it's not at the levels of what we've seen before with the bubonic plague and others. So I do hope it wakes us up, and I think that's the number one lesson here. In terms of education, I think it's TBD yet. We're in the thick of the crisis, and I don't know what the major takeaways will be or how society will evolve based on everybody examining what the purpose of school is and what it's like for families when you don't have school. So I'm a little hesitant to answer that because I don't think we know yet.
It's been really enjoyable. We look forward to spending more time with you, but thanks for your wisdom and for your frankness and for your advice.